The gray skin of Alaric's face slid onto the marble floor. It made a wet sound. He clawed at his throat, his fingernails tearing red gashes into his jaw. The Sunbringer sword didn't just break. The gold hilt turned to rust and drifted away. The scales of truth hit the stone altar with a weight that shook the cathedral walls. The verdict burned in the air. Fraud. 10 minutes ago, Alaric was a god in a gold suit. The gala air was thick with the scent of roasted meat and heavy wine. Alara knelt in the shadows behind the main table. Her hands were wrapped in coarse bandages. Iron-scented blood soaked through the white cloth. She was the medicine slave. She was the battery for the Duke's body. Every morning she drained her veins into a silver goblet. Alaric took her life to fuel his sword. He grew strong. Alara turned to bone. Alaric walked toward her. His gold-plated boots vibrated the floorboards. He looked down with a sneer that showed his yellow teeth. "You are filth," Alaric said. He raised his right boot. He slammed the heel down on Alara's bandaged fingers. The sound of crushing bone filled the silence. Alara bit her lip until it bled. She didn't scream. She stared at the wine stain on the stone. "I asked for the healing draught," Alaric barked. He ground his heel into her broken hand. He twisted his weight. "Why is this batch weak? The rot is returning to my bones." "I have no more blood to give," Alara whispered. Her voice was a dry rasp. "You have drained the marrow." Alaric laughed. He kicked her in the ribs. Alara hit the floor. Her head struck the sharp edge of the marble table. Blood ran down her temple. "Then find more," Alaric sneered. He snatched a vial from her belt. It held her last drop of essence. He didn't drink it. He poured the liquid onto the floor. The golden fluid hissed on the cold stone. It turned into a brown stain. "Lick it up, slave. You are polluting my air." The nobles cheered. They held their silver cups high. They saw a broken tool. They saw a nameless slave. The air changed. The scent of ozone hit the room. The heavy oak doors exploded. Shards of wood flew through the hall. One piece sliced the cheek of a countess. A man stepped through the dust. He was tall. He wore black dragon scale armor. This was Xander, the Black Dragon Emperor. His presence hit the room with physical force. The nobles fell back. The wine glasses shattered from the pressure of his aura. Xander didn't look at Alaric. He didn't look at the throne. His eyes stayed on the floor. He saw the woman in the rags. He saw the blood on the marble. He walked forward. His boots made a rhythmic, heavy sound on the stone. Xander stopped in front of Alaric. He was a head taller. He smelled of leather and burnt wood. "Your boots are dirty," Xander said. His voice was a low growl. Alaric tried to stand straight. His knees shook. He reached for his empty scabbard. "Your Majesty, she is a slave. She tried to poison me. The records show she is a criminal." Xander didn't speak. He reached out. He grabbed Alaric's throat with one hand. He lifted the Duke off the floor. Alaric's legs kicked the air. His face turned a bruised purple. "I know this scent," Xander whispered. He ignored the guards. He ignored the drawn swords. He leaned close to Alaric's ear. "This blood on the floor saved my life in the trenches. It didn't come from a coward in a gold suit." Xander dropped him. Alaric hit the floor. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs. Xander knelt in the blood. He didn't care about his imperial armor. He reached out. He took Alara's broken hand. His touch was hot. It was heavy. "Every drop of blood on this floor," Xander said. He looked at the nobles. "It will cost this city a mountain of gold. Every bruise on her skin, that will cost a life." He pulled a black dagger from his belt. He cut his own palm. He pressed his hand against Alara's. "Drink," Xander commanded. Alara looked up. She saw the predator. She saw the king. She drank. The dragon's blood scalded her throat. It ignited her veins. Her eyes turned a lethal gold. The bandages on her hands began to smoke. The cloth turned to ash. The pain in her ribs vanished. The status flip was instant. The slave was gone. The oracle was waking up. Alaric scrambled backward. He reached for his broken sword. "She is mine. I have the blood contract." "The contract is written in stolen life," Xander said. He stood up. He pulled Alara to her feet. He kept his arm locked around her waist. He held her flush against his chest, and I just tore it up. The high judge stepped forward. He held the scales of truth. "The evidence is absolute. The Duke is a thief. His titles are void. Strip him." Xander ordered. The guards didn't hesitate. They didn't bow to Alaric. They grabbed his arms. They ripped the gold sash from his chest. They tore the medals from his tunic. Alaric clawed at the stone. His nails left white scratches on the marble. "I am a Valerius," Alaric shouted. Xander stepped on Alaric's left hand. The remaining bones snapped. "You are nothing. You are a ghost in a stolen house. You don't even have a last name." The high judge raised a black crystal. The air inside the cathedral throbbed. This was the stone of memory. It recorded every debt. It recorded every drop of blood. The judge placed the stone on the scales of truth. A white light erupted from the crystal. It projected a massive image against the vaulted ceiling. The nobles looked up. They didn't see a hero. They saw a muddy trench from 3 years ago. They saw a younger Alara. She was covered in dirt. She was dragging Xander's unconscious body toward a cave. She used a jagged rock to slice her own forearm. She pressed her bleeding skin against Xander's mouth. The gold blood saved him. Then the image changed. Alaric appeared in the frame. He hid behind a pile of wooden crates. He waited for Alara to collapse from exhaustion. When she fell, he stepped out. He didn't help her. He used his dagger to slash her face. He took Xander's hand. He dragged the Emperor a few feet. He began to scream for help. He claimed the victory. He claimed the life debt. The light faded. The silence in the hall was heavy. "You thief!" the Countess yelled. She stepped forward. She tore a necklace of rubies from her neck. She threw the stones at Alaric's face. The gems hit his cheek. They left red welts. "I gave you my family's loyalty for a lie." Alaric wiped the sweat from his forehead. His palms were wet. He looked at the other nobles. He saw only teeth. "I saved the border. My knights fought the monsters." "Your knights fought with her blood on their blades," the Baron roared. He spat on Alaric's golden boots. "You are a parasite." Xander didn't move. He kept his arm locked around Alara's waist. He felt the heat of the dragon blood moving through her skin. He leaned down. He smelled the iron on her breath. "The Baron is right," Xander said. His voice was a flat, lethal blade. "You used her marrow to build your walls. Now I will use your bones to pave her path." Xander reached out. He grabbed the gold sash on Alaric's shoulder. He didn't unhook it. He ripped it. The silk screamed as it tore. The metals hit the floor. "I am a Duke of the Empire." Alaric shrieked. He fell to his knees. He grabbed the hem of Xander's cloak. "You cannot strip a Valerius without a trial." "There is no Valerius here," the judge said. He opened a heavy leather ledger. He took a pen. He drew a thick black line through Alaric's name. "The name is struck. The house is closed. You are a nameless vagrant." The guards stepped forward. They used the butts of their spears. They slammed the wood into Alaric's shoulders. He hit the stone floor. He looked at the nobles. He saw his mistress turn her back. He saw his generals drop their swords. "My gold." Alaric wheezed. He reached into his tunic. He pulled out a heavy iron key. "I still have the vault. You can't take the wealth." Alara walked forward. Her black dress hissed against the marble. She stopped in front of him. She reached down. She took the key from his shaking hand. "The vault didn't recognize your blood, Alaric," Alara said. Her voice was steady. "It recognized the gold I made. It recognized the life I gave it." She squeezed the iron key. The metal began to glow red. It softened. The iron turned to liquid. It dripped through her fingers and sizzled on Alaric's chest. He screamed. The smell of burning wool filled the air. "The vault is empty," Alara said. She looked down at him. "I spent it all. I bought your debts. I bought your creditors. Every stone in your castle now belongs to the people you starved." Xander stepped behind her. He wrapped his hands over hers. He locked his fingers with hers. He was a cage of hot muscle. "The rats are hungry, Alaric," Xander whispered. He looked at the guards. "Take him to the edge of the city. Strip him of his boots. Let him walk in the mud he created." The guards grabbed Alaric by the hair. They dragged him toward the doors. His head hit the steps. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a sack of waste. Xander turned Alara around. He gripped her chin. His thumb pressed into her lower lip. It was rough. It was possessive. "The house is clean," Xander said. He looked at the remaining nobles. "Now we discuss the price of your silence." The nobles didn't wait. They hit the floor. Their foreheads struck the marble. They didn't pray to a god. They prayed to the woman in the black dress. Alara felt the pulse of the dragon blood in her veins. It was a rhythmic thrum. It moved from her heart to her fingertips. The bandages on her arms were gone. The skin beneath was smooth. The scars had vanished. The iron mines, Alara said. She looked at the Baron. Who manages the production? The Baron trembled. He didn't look up. I do, Your Grace. But the workers are striking. The equipment is rusted. The equipment is rusted because Alaric sold the oil to buy his gold statues, Alara said. She walked to the center of the hall. She picked up a heavy silver goblet. She crushed it in her bare hand. The metal buckled. You will go to the mines. You will give the workers half the profits. If you steal a single copper, I will let Xander deal with you. The Baron's face went white. He nodded until his chin hit the stone. Xander walked to her side. He put his hand on the small of her back. The heat of his palm soaked through her dress. He will not steal, Xander said. He knows I am counting the coins. Xander looked at the lead guard. Bring the chests, the ones from the Duke's private study. 4 guards marched in. They carried wooden boxes bound in iron. They dropped them on the floor. The impact made the dust dance. 1 guard forced the lids open. Inside were stacks of paper. These were the land deeds. These were the debt contracts Alaric had used to enslave the farmers. Alara reached into the chest. She took a handful of papers. She didn't read them. She walked to the ceremonial brazier in the corner. She threw the papers into the fire. The flames turned blue. The ink sizzled. The smell of burning parchment filled the hall. The debts are dead, Alara shouted. Her voice echoed off the ceiling. The land belongs to the hands that tilled it. Alara took the Duke's signet ring from the floor. She placed it on a flat stone. She took a heavy iron hammer from a nearby guard. She swung the hammer. The gold ring flattened. The red gem shattered into dust. The House of Valerius is a memory, Alara said. She looked at the High Judge. Write it in the books. From this day, the territory is the protectorate of the Dragon Oracle. Alaric felt the cold weight of the mud. It filled his mouth. It filled his nose. The gray rot on his jaw moved to his neck. He tried to grab the wooden wheel of a passing cart. The wood was wet. The iron rim was jagged. A farmer saw the gray skin and the rotting ear. He didn't see a savior. He raised a heavy leather whip. The leather bit into Alaric's neck. Alaric hit the muck. The heavy wheel rolled over his hand. The bone turned to gravel in the dirt. He tried to scream. No sound came out. The memory wipe was a cold iron nail in his brain. He forgot the layout of his palace. He forgot the color of his own eyes. He was a biological stain on the road. A stray dog sniffed his leg. It bit the rotting flesh. Alaric watched the animal. He didn't feel the teeth. He was the earth now. Inside the palace, the heat from the forge reached the throne room. Alara stood at the long oak table. She held a heavy iron stamp. She pressed the metal into a slab of hot red wax. The seal showed a dragon's head. The grain stores are open, Alara said. She didn't look up. She signed a parchment with a sharp motion. The men get 3 sacks. The women get 4. If a guard takes a copper, hang him from the gate. Xander stood behind her. He had removed his heavy chest plate. He wore a thin black shirt. The fabric was tight across his shoulders. He smelled of raw leather and burnt cedar. He placed his hands on the table on either side of Alara. He boxed her in. His body was a wall of heat. The lords are complaining, Xander whispered. He leaned down. His nose brushed against the side of her neck. They say you are stealing the winter profit. They didn't earn the profit, Alara said. She took another deed. She ripped the paper in half. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. The workers earned it. The lords just watched me bleed. Xander growled. He turned her around. He grabbed her waist and lifted her onto the edge of the heavy table. The wood was hard against her thighs. Xander stepped between her knees. He was a predator. He gripped her chin with his thumb and forefinger. He forced her to look at his burning gold eyes. You are making enemies, Alara, Xander said. His voice was a low vibration. He ran his other hand down her arm. He felt the smooth skin where the scars used to be. They will try to kill you in the dark. Let them try, Alara said. She grabbed his collar. She pulled him closer until their chests touched. She felt the heavy beat of his heart. I have a dragon. Why should I fear sheep? Xander laughed. He bent his head and bit the junction of her neck and shoulder. He didn't use his teeth to hurt. He used them to mark her. Alara felt the sting. She felt the heat move into her bones. She dug her fingernails into his back. She wanted the pressure. She wanted the weight. A group of priests marched into the hall. They wore white silk robes. The high priest held a staff, tipped with a massive blue stone. He pointed the staff at Alara. "You have closed the tithe boxes," the priest shouted. "You have taken the gold from the altar. This is a sin against the gods." Alara didn't stop. She walked to the priest. She was shorter, but she looked down at him. She reached out and grabbed the blue stone on his staff. She squeezed her fist. The dragon blood in her veins hummed. The stone turned red. Then it shattered. The blue shards hit the floor. They sounded like breaking ice. "The tithe boxes are closed because the people are hungry," Alara said. Her voice was a blade. "The gold on the altar is now bread in the market. If your gods are angry, tell them to come find me." The priest backed away. He looked at his broken staff. He looked at Xander. Xander hadn't drawn his sword. He just narrowed his eyes. The air around the priest turned cold. The oil in his ceremonial jars began to freeze. The ceramic cracked. "Leave," Alara commanded. "Take your silk. Go to the mines. Work the drills. If you want to eat, you will earn the bread." The priest turned and ran. He tripped on his long robes. The status flip was total. The temple was empty. The palace was a fortress. The slave was the Iron Queen. Xander walked up behind Alara. He wrapped his arms around her neck. He locked his fingers over her chest. He pulled her back against his heat. "You are stripping them of everything," Xander murmured. He smelled the fire on her skin. "Their names, their gold, their gods. I am stripping them of their lies," Alara said. She looked at the gate. She saw a cart being pushed out of the city. It was filled with waste. She saw a man in the mud, being covered by the filth. It was Alaric. He didn't move. He didn't fight. He was just a shape in the dirt. "Is he still alive?" Xander asked. "His heart is beating," Alara said. "But Alaric died the moment he touched my hand on the dais. The thing in the mud is just a reminder." Xander turned her around. He picked her up. He carried her toward the inner chambers. "Good," Xander said. "I don't like to share my reminders." The rain at the city edge turned to sleet. The ice hit Alaric's skin. It didn't melt. His body was too cold to fight the frost. The gray rot on his jaw moved to his throat. He stared at the gray sky. He didn't see the light. He was a biological stain in the mud. A heavy cart filled with iron scrap rolled past. The driver didn't look at the ditch. The wooden wheel caught Alaric's remaining good arm. The bone snapped. The sound was a sharp, dry snap. Alaric's mouth opened. He wanted to scream. No sound came out. His lungs were filled with the smell of wet earth and rotted manure. He was no longer a man. He was a piece of the city's waste. A stray pig returned to the ditch. It began to eat the rotting flesh of Alaric's leg. Alaric watched the animal. He didn't have a name. He didn't have a memory. The memory wipe was total. He was a ghost in a rotting shell. His heart gave one last weak throb. Then it stopped. The mud covered his face. The world moved on. Inside the palace, the coronation was a battlefield of papers and gold. Alara stood on the high dais. She didn't wear a crown of gold. She held the duke's old ceremonial helmet. She placed it on the floor. She took a heavy iron hammer from the lead smith. She swung the hammer. The metal buckled. The duke's family crest was crushed into a flat sheet of gray iron. Alara picked up the scrap. She threw it into the furnace. "The old names are ash," Alara said. Her voice was a sharp blade in the silent hall. Xander stood behind her. He had removed his black shirt. His skin was covered in scars and dragon scale tattoos. He was a wall of hot muscle. He smelled of wood smoke and raw leather. He stepped forward and grabbed Alara's hand. He held it over the fire. He didn't use a ring. He used a red-hot iron brand. The metal was shaped like a dragon's tooth. "The marks of the slave are gone," Xander growled. He pressed the hot iron into the stone of the throne's armrest. The rock turned red. It hissed. "The mark of the Empress is here." He turned Alara toward him. He gripped her waist. His fingers dug into her skin. He was a cage of heat. He lifted her until her eyes were level with his. He bit the side of her neck. He tasted the iron in her blood. He tasted the fire of the dragon. The lords are dead, Xander whispered. His voice was a low vibration in her marrow. The priests are in the mud. The gold is in the forge. What is left? The future, Alara said. She didn't pull away. She wrapped her arms around his neck. She felt the heavy beat of his heart. It was a rhythmic thrum in her chest. And the fire. She looked at the remaining generals. They were on their knees. They didn't move. They didn't breathe. They were terrified of the woman on the throne. They were terrified of the beast behind her. Go to the borders, Alara commanded. Her voice echoed off the high stone ceiling. Take the black banners. Tell the neighbors that the oracle is gone. The dragon is here.
The generals ran for the exit. Their boots made a heavy sound on the marble.
Xander pulled Alara closer. He pressed his face into her hair. He smelled the iron and the smoke. He was the shadow that covered her world. He was the weapon she held. The debt is finished, Xander murmured. The debt is just starting, Alara said. She looked at the smoke rising from the city chimneys. She took the dragon mark seal from the table. She didn't put it on her finger. She used it to stamp the final decree. The wax was red. It looked like a fresh wound. The doors of the cathedral slammed shut. The sound was a final blow. The Alpha's shadow had claimed the sun, and the sun was ready to burn the empire to the ground. The history of Alaric was gone. The era of the Iron Queen had begun.
Seeing Alaric stripped of his name and left to rot in the very mud he created is the most satisfying trash-to-trash recycling program I've seen in years. But here is the real question for you. Is total memory erasure a mercy, or is forcing a man with that much ego to live as a literal nobody the ultimate psychological torture? Honestly, I debated letting the pigs finish the job in the final draft, but I decided the mud was poetic enough. It's the only throne Alaric ever actually earned.